Hello and welcome to this episode of Framlingham College In Conversation. I'm Ophelia, and today, ahead of delivery of his acclaimed Brain Day, we are joined by Dr Guy Sutton, Director of Medical Biology Interactive. Welcome, Dr Sutton.
Thank you. Hello.
Along with my fellow pupils, Abdul, Martha and Emily, we are looking forward to asking you a few questions about your neuroscience knowledge and expertise. Can we begin, Dr Sutton, by you giving us some background to where your interest started and a summary of your career to date?
Yes, my interest in the brain started as an undergraduate, but I'd originally started thinking I was going to be an artist, but my A-levels were in arts and sciences, and I converted from art into psychology and physiology effectively. Became very, very interested in the brain, and then my PhD was in more physiological psychology, looking at the role of emotions in cardiovascular function. And then in my postdoctoral research, I went into looking at a variety of different factors linked to the brain, biological factors linked to the brain. I have worked for the Medical Research Council, for the Department of Health on various projects, and my work's taken me through a number of different universities. I've lectured at several universities in the UK. Most recently, I was in an honorary capacity honorary consultant assistant professor in neuroscience at the University of Nottingham School of Medicine, where I taught and examined undergraduate and postgraduate medical students. But I've always been attracted to really what happens when things go wrong. So I've had an interest in the role of the mind in disease, been interested in the role of psychological factors in cardiovascular disease, for example, but I'm also very interested in molecular biology and genetics and how the environment and genetics and biological factors all interact in disease processes. That said, I've also been involved in work with psychiatric disorder. So in Nottingham, I was based in the Division of Psychiatry. So my work has been quite varied, and I've always been interested in the complex factors that underpin many disease processes.
Your primary research interests include the genetics of neural development and brain function. Can you tell us what can we expect from Brain Day?
Yeah, what I'm really hoping that students will get, whether they're psychologists, whether they're biologists from Brain Day, will be an understanding of the complexity of human brain function, or at least an introduction to the complexity, because, of course, we're scratching the surface of our understanding of the brain at the moment. Whilst we might recommend a textbook to undergraduates that's 1,800 pages thick on neuroscience. In fact, with those 1,800 pages, a lot of information is conveyed. We still really don't understand how two nerve cells communicate sufficiently to understand how consciousness arises, for example. So there are, even with things that you might expect that we'd know a lot about, awareness, for example, which is one of the fundamental properties of organisms with the nervous system, we don't really understand that much about what's going on in terms of brain function. So there's a lot to learn still. We understand, but we don't understand. So I hope that students will get a flavour for the complexities of brain function. I want students to understand the complexities of disorders. Why is it that we don't understand Alzheimer's disease? Why that we can't treat disorders such as this, neurodegenerative conditions, in other words. And the reason for this is, again, because of the complexity of these processes. I want students also to get a flavour for a university-style day. So in university, lectures are still the main way in which information is presented. You need a good attention span. I want students to understand that there's a lot of reading involved in degree study. I would say twofold the aims of Brain Day: to understand the brain in a little more detail, and also to get a flavour for university-style sessions and a university-style day.
Delving a little deeper into your areas of expertise, Dr Sutton, we have a few specific questions based on areas of interest in our own studies. Can I firstly ask, do you believe that obesity is caused by biological factors or psychological factors? And if psychological, how would we go around tackling obesity?
Okay. I think the way that you're phrasing this in terms of either or is probably the wrong way to think about not only obesity, but most complex disorders. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about cancers, doesn't matter whether you're talking about, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Alzheimer's disease. Schizophrenia would be another example. It's a complex interplay of a multitude of factors. Often within psychology and perhaps within biology, there is this debate that has raged for centuries. Is it nature? Is it nurture? And the way it's often phrased is, for example, intelligence a product of nature or nurture? And it's the wrong way to think about it, in my opinion. It would be a combination of nature and nurture. So taking this back to obesity is a complex interplay of many different factors. And it's compounded, this problem is compounded by the fact that obesity is variable from person to person. So there are many different reasons why people become obese. Yes, there can be genetic influences in obesity. Yes, there can be psychological influences in ability, and often the two will come together. But if you're looking at, for example, the way that genes work in obesity, we have probably between about 100 and 400 genes that have been linked directly or indirectly to obesity. Now, some of these genes will have very significant effects, like the POMC gene, for example, has been linked to particular mechanisms underpinning obesity. But often there will be combinations of environment and genes at play with such conditions. So when we talk about whether it being biological or psychological, in fact, often these conditions are an interaction of factors. When you're looking at psychological factors, you're talking about everything that range from people feeling low in mood. So low mood and depression can be linked to increased appetite, for example, and compulsive eating. But of course, there are different reasons why people put on weight and why people become different weights. You have stress, you have early eating environments that are learned from parents, eating habits that are learned. And then, of course, we're faced with the world today where we're bombarded with ultra-high processed food, which does nothing for the body or indeed for the mind. We have very clear links, not only between ultra-high processed food and obesity, weight gain. We have it linked to cardiovascular function, diabetes, stroke, cerebrovascular infarctions, events, for example. We have ultra-high processed food linked to anxiety and depression. So there's, again, a really complex interplay of factors here. You have a growing number of people who are sedentary, who aren't exercising, and we then have to think of the role of social media and the fact that children are exercising less, so we're getting more weight gain in children. So these are very, very complex factors with many environmental, psychological, biological, genetic factors coming to play and interacting. And so when we start to think about treating conditions such as obesity, it becomes much more complex than initially it might seem. People will naively sometimes say, people who are overweight and who are morbidly obese, in inverted commas, just need to be motivated and realise that they're putting their own health at risk, increasing their risk of all sorts of problems, including certain cancers. But it's often much more complex than that, and you do have to have motivation to lose weight in many cases, but also people have to be taught ways in which they can lose weight. The importance of exercise emphasised, the importance of not radical changes in diet, but slowly but surely changes in diet. So there are lots of tweaks that need to be conducted with people's behaviour really to actually maximise ideal weight. It's not as simple as it originally seems. And to go back to your original question, I don't think we can actually say that obesity is either or. Genetics, psychological, it's a mixture of lots of factors.
Dr Sutton, do you believe that criminals can truly be reintegrated into society and that it will never offend again? Or once a criminal, always a criminal?
It's an interesting question again, and I think we're faced with exactly the same issue. These are very, very complex issues, and I want some of the work that I do is with barristers and judges. So in my capacity now within Medical Biology Interactive, my company, I work in an applied setting for much of the time outside of universities. I work with the legal profession, and if you ask most judges, for example, about offenders' backgrounds, for example, they'll often say that violent offenders come from very, very difficult backgrounds. They've had very difficult early lives, which potentially have shaped the brain in particular ways. And what we do know is that when you get to a particular level of development, psychological function and behavior becomes more increasingly difficult to change. So by the time you become an adult, behavioral patterns are often established, neural circuitry that underpin these behaviors is often established. So I would say that we can't talk about offenders as a group of people with every offender the same as the next. You've got in prison, you have burglars, you have rapists, you have murderers, you have embezzlers, you have paedophiles, you have white-collar criminals and fraudsters, you have the wrong time, wrong places, you've got everybody. It's a mix of all sorts of different people with different backgrounds, with different social histories, with different physical problems, with different mental health problems. There's so many differences between offenders. So when we ask this question whether all offenders are going to be offenders for the rest of their life. I mean, we can look at statistics. I think in 2022, 2023, there was a study in America where they found that after about, I think it was within 3 years of release, some 400,000 offenders they'd looked at, I think some 68% had actually reoffended within that 3-year period. 5 years after release, 77% had. Now, if you were to take those kinds of statistics, you might argue, well, there you go. That's kind of proof, again, in inverted commas, that most offenders are offenders for the rest of their lives. They'll go back and reoffend. And in fact, in the UK, we have, after 1 year, about a 42% recidivism rate. So around about 42% of offenders will reoffend in the first year after release. But does that mean to say that they're reoffending because they are born criminals, or because society doesn't put things in place to aid them reintegrating back into society? For example, what are we looking at? Probably around at least half of all people in prison, or certainly people that have been convicted of certain crimes, would be drug users. So we have about half of all people in prison with a drug habit, a drug problem. Now, what we don't have are effective drug rehabilitation programs, particularly for offenders. If you're not going to set things in place for offenders once they've left prison to be reintegrated, starting with the main problem, which is often their drug use, and these people become homeless again because we don't have places that they can go and stay often. They can't find habitation that is suitable. You've got a whole host of environmental issues, social problems that increase the likelihood of them reoffending. So you can see the complexity here. It's not as simple as saying offenders will reoffend because their brain makes them do it. Although there are certain offenders who have brain injuries, a lot of offenders will have had difficult backgrounds where their brain has changed. And in a percentage of those offenders, it seems likely that the brain injuries and the problems that they have, be they mental health problems or otherwise, increase the likelihood of the reoffending. But there are many other factors also that are actually interacting to actually determine whether or not an offender will reoffend. So I think we have some fairly good evidence that if you put things in place for offenders, and if we use cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, for example, for those people that require it, then reintegration can occur. But it's not going to be with everybody. With sex offenders, you've got a very, very difficult group of offenders that vary in terms of the reasons why they have committed sexual offenses in the first place, different backgrounds, different experiences, which means that there isn't a one treatment for all approach here. And the problem is we have a complete absence of the gold standard, which is the randomized control trial. So that would be the ideal. As we use it within medicine, it should be used within, one might argue, reintegration of criminals as well, to be able to compare people that have had different treatments, for example, and how they fare in the environment, or whether they reoffend or not. But I don't think that all criminals are born. Some may have brain injuries that are increasing the likelihood of offences, but I'm not convinced that all people will be criminals for the rest of their lives. Some will. There'll be career criminals for a variety of different reasons. And I think we need to invest more money in rehabilitation. Neural rehabilitation as well. If you've got brain injuries, rehabilitate neurologically, as opposed to just throwing people back into society and they're in the same boat that they were before they went into prison.
In your opinion, can we observe epigenetic effects on human brain function?
Absolutely. I've written articles on epigenetics, and I have been filmed for programs with epigenetics, and I absolutely believe that epigenetics are linked to many, many different aspects of mental life. We know that epigenetics, and let's define it in a simple sense. epigenetics is in fact quite complex biochemistry and molecular biology. But in a simple sense, it's the expression and silencing, the switching on and switching off of genes. And many things can do this. We can have intrinsic biological mechanisms within the body that are involved in gene expression and gene silencing. But we also have environmental factors that will alter the way that genes are expressed as well. So, for example, we have everything from diet, stress, drugs, all epigenetically altering mechanisms within nerve cells to change the way that the brain works. But in a relatively simple sense, before we get into disorder, memory processes are epigenetically driven. So when we experience things in the world around us and memories are formed, the memories are formed through epigenetic alterations in nerve cells. I don't know whether anybody is aware of just how complex memories are, but they're chemical and genetic alterations in nerve cells and synapses. And of course, it's changes in genes and the biochemistry of the nerve cell that underpin the memories that we have. And so we have the environment interacting with the genes, which then alter the way the nerve cells work to house the memory. So with thinking, with cognition, with memory, epigenetic processes drive these brain processes. But we can take it further, because if we look at the majority of psychiatric disorders, but in particular the very severe psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression to an extent, if we look at neurological and neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, we actually have epigenetic mechanisms linked to the disease as well as gene mutation. So it should be realized that many of the brain disorders that years ago used to thought of as gene mutations, errors in the genetic material, actually have quite significant epigenetic components to them, we now realize. So the logic would be that we have, when we take a disorder like schizophrenia, which is a profound disturbance of thinking and perception and mind, when we take such a disorder, yes, we have gene mutations. We have alterations in nerve cells, in genes that alter the way the nerve cells are functioning. But then we have epigenetic effects as well. So we have the environment interacting with the genes, switching them on and off to change the way the brain pathways are working and thus altering behavior. Just for the edification of biologists, we also have what we call copy number variation in schizophrenia, where millions of bases are deleted or copied over and over again in a small percentage, but we have it. And in also a small percentage in schizophrenia, we have what are called line 1 retrotransposons, which are jumping genes, which are jumping around the chromosomes and destabilizing things. So yeah, we have epigenetic effects in the brain in typical psychological function and thinking, and then we have epigenetic alterations in disease and disorder.
Thank you, Dr. Sutton, for such an informative discussion. We are grateful to you for giving up your time to chat to us, and we look forward to learning more from you during Brain Day.
Pleasure. Thank you.